And we're live. I'm Sebastien Couture, and I'm the host of the Interop. The Interop is a podcast that's all about understanding the economic decentralized networks that make up the interchain. I'm here today with Brainjar, who is the CEO of Composable Finance. How you doing, Brainjar?
Hey, thanks for having me.
Thanks for being here. I'm really excited to finally have this conversation on the podcast and get deep into all of the visionary aspects, but also the technical components that make up Composable Finance. I think it's a project that, like, a lot of folks in the ecosystem are exposed to, but for me, like, there's still some aspects of the project that I really want to understand how it works and how it all connects to each other. So, really happy to have you on. Before we get started, though, if you're a fan of what we're doing here, please consider subscribing, hit the like button, hit the bell notification on your phone to get notified when new live streams go live. And we usually go live on Thursday. And if you want to support the work we're doing, please consider staking to our EVMOS validator. And the link is down in the show notes. So with that out of the way, tell me a little bit about your background, where you came from, and how you became to be a brain in a jar.
Yeah, so I studied, basically, I always used to be interested in bio, actually. So I was doing a lot of bio research, like worked at like different research labs, doing like cryo-EM, structural biology, and then sort of studied physics and econ at Yale, and then later on moved to do sort of like, basically went full-time crypto and started writing white papers for a bunch of projects in the space and like trying to help people sort of design protocols. Then I basically became a like farming degen when DeFi summer started in 2020, then started Composable in 2021.
And so you're like more in, you study biology, right?
I
Is that
studied
right?
physics and econ in college, but I spent
Okay.
a lot of my time doing bio research. Yeah.
Okay. Like for like pharmaceuticals or?
So it was basically like we were studying the Golgi apparatus, which is this organelle in the cell that does like packaging of proteins before they're exported out of the cell. So like heavy biophysics, basically, um, which actually like a lot of people sort of like, I feel like a lot of people in this space do come from bio because it's like a very mechanistic,
Yeah.
specifically biophysics, like it's a very mechanistic ecosystem. Like having blockchains talk to each other is very much so similar to how cells like talk to each other from a mechanistic perspective.
Yeah,
Um,
that's so interesting.
yeah, so I
Yeah.
think it's like all this stuff really came sort of naturally to me. So yeah, it was definitely a good background for this space.
Yeah, cool. Yeah, I mean, Meher Roy, who's my co-host on Epicenter, is also a biochemical engineer, worked in pharma for many years, and I've definitely crossed a lot of those folks, in crypto, like physicists and people who study like bioengineering and that kind of thing. So yeah, interesting. And so from that, like, how did you transition into crypto? Like you said, you were doing some DeFi degen stuff, but like, what was the moment where you said, "Huh, like these cells are interoperating in this way. This is how it should be done in crypto"?
Yeah, I mean, so I think basically like I was a Bitcoin maxi in like 2013, 2014, and then I
Weren't we all?
discovered, yeah, and then I discovered Ethereum and Polkadot and Cosmos kind of like one after the other. And then I was really like excited about Polkadot and Cosmos because for the first time it was like deprioritization of chains actually talking to each other,
Yeah.
which for me was interesting because we wouldn't have this like capability. We would no longer have like this segmentation of maximalism across the different ecosystems, which like in 2017, 2018, the narrative was always like, oh, like ETH is going to flip Bitcoin. And then there's all these like ETH killers out there. And I just sort of like realized at some point there's going to need to be an interoperability solution that connects all of these things, even if like I don't believe that there's going to be application specific like chains. I think there's going to be application specific ecosystems that have application specific chains, but maybe like each ecosystem has like a specific blend of applications that exist within it. And so with that thesis, I was like looking to see what was out there and researched Connects and researched a bunch of other trusted bridges and quickly realized like there is a need for this stuff, especially with L2s coming out. And yeah, I think just being a farmer and seeing like how bad the gas prices were when people were actually using the chain, like the fall of 2020 specifically, I think there was like something really went off in my head where I realized like we do need trustless bridging infrastructure, but more so than that, like the fact that all these applications went multi-chain, but then had segmented liquidity. There needed to be an application layer that actually people could build applications that could unify and talk to all these different segments of a specific protocol across multiple chains. So I realized there was this need, and this, I think the ecosystem that I realized we would need sort of like a robust infrastructure for this as an actual chain, and also shared security. And so we decided to launch as a Polkadot chain, but the plan was always to incorporate things like CosmWasm and IBC to achieve this greater vision. And for me, like this greater vision is just creating the best possible user experiences for people accessing Web3, but like not actually just BSing about it, but doing it in a methodical way where there's like the contract layer, IBC, and the infrastructure.
Yeah, and reading through your docs and all the times that like I've heard you speak, or I was at your event, I was in Berlin a few months ago, and you know, there's certainly like a very technical aspect to everything you're doing, and like you're building really sort of deep crypto tech, and that's super interesting. But I think like through all of your communication and also like the branding, I think that what really bleeds through is this idea that the user experience is why we're doing all of this, right? Like it's not just building cool tech to build cool tech; it's like actually building applications and experiences that people can use. And so yeah, I think that's pretty cool, and it's quite unique. Not every kind of blockchain project I think looks at it this way. Yeah, I mean, I think I agree with your thesis that there are application specific ecosystems and then chains within those, and the need to create interoperability there is really it's really critical. And you know, early today, like as I was preparing for this, I was thinking about like what's a good analogy, because I'm always trying to like analogize what's happening in crypto to what exists in the real world, because speaking with like investors and people who don't get it, and so like who need some kind of frame of reference. And you know, like there's been this concept of like city states, nation states, and you know how cities relate to boroughs, and this kind of analogy. And I think one analogy that might be fitting is to look at, you know, the major financial centers in the world. So you have like New York, and like there's the New York Stock Exchange and NASDAQ, and then you have like the London Stock Exchange, and then Amsterdam, and maybe like the Chicago Commodities Exchange, whatever that one there is, and like all these financial centers. They all have, you know, their kind of core proprietary infrastructure that's sitting there in the building, and like NASDAQ has all these server rooms where like companies can come and like put their algorithms there. But then there's like all these other kind of rails and I guess like pipes that allow liquidity to move in and out of that. And like it might be a bank or something that, you know, is sitting in New York, but is also sitting in London, and they get to move liquidity from like one exchange to another. And like these are kind of the you know, comparatively in crypto, like the interoperability layers, like that allows liquidity to move from one proprietary sort of system to another proprietary system. I'm just like kind of spitting this out now without having really thought so much about it, but it feels a little bit kind of like that when I'm looking at like what you guys are building, what other folks in the space are building.
Yeah, I mean, I think the biggest like for me.
Hello? Yeah.
Okay, I'm
I
back.
think you're back. Yeah.
So what I've always likened this to is basically equities. So there's the first ever post I put out on Medium was about DTCC and what it did for the ecosystem. So DTCC is the Depository Trust Corporation. Not a lot of people know about this, but it basically does all the settlement for all equities across the United States, and actually assets that are not settled by DTCC, like leveraged loans, like exotics, etc., various derivatives. These things end up taking such a long time to settle. Like T plus 28 is like average for leveraged loans. But in equities, like we had NYSE, we had NASDAQ, we had all these different small little brokers that made a bunch of money in the 80s that could quote better prices because they had a better relationship with XYZ exchange than some other broker. Then along came DTCC, which basically said, okay, guys, all things now need to have a QSIP ID, and all things now basically need to trade and settle according to our ledger.
Yeah.
And that just ended up resulting in electronification, right? Because then someone like Dark Pools said, okay, all I need to do is build a plugin on top of this settlement layer, and I have a dark pool. And that's when people like Robinhood and others, a light really went off in their heads and said, okay, with this electronification that just happened, now we can make it such that a user buys a stock, Google or something, and they don't care which exchange, who settled it, why, when it got settled, they just know that they bought the stock. And I think that is really much so like how I see things evolving in crypto as well. Like when you have interoperability and when you have orchestration, you can then have primitives on top, things like MEV, things like other sort of like arbitrage opportunities, etc. And from there, you then can have these like generalized application frameworks. Like we've released some example UIs of what you could build with XCVM. And it's literally just looks like an email. Like you start with these assets on these 3 chains, and you then want to compose those assets into these 3 assets on these 3 chains. That's it. And at some point too, people may even stop caring about the chain that they're on and just know like where their money is. And so I think that is like what I'm hoping to do is to provide the interoperability primitives by extending IBC to other ecosystems, provide the orchestration framework with XCVM, and then have like a bunch of UI tooling for people to actually build applications, because this stuff can't just be a plugin, right? We are also working on a plugin, which is a bit of an alpha leak for people to be able to build integrations with XCVM that allow them to do stuff from the front end perspective. It's called xcvm.js. But for someone to actually wrap their head around how do I visualize a cross-chain interaction, I'm pretty sure there's probably like 20 designers out there that actually could build a UI that's not clunky to show this, because every single cross-chain application is terrible, or at least for the most part. So I think, that's also why we're releasing a ton of UI tools in the coming weeks and months.
Yeah, I mean, I think it's like great to be opinionated about UI too, right? Because you kind of set standards early. Like look at something like Uniswap, like that UI. Also, although I would argue maybe that the Uniswap UI was actually pioneered by Shapeshift.
Yeah.
A long time ago. But you know what I mean? Like, I mean, once that UI has been established, now everybody kind of uses that UI, and to have like strong opinions about how that should look like, I think it like goes a long way in creating standards, and that people are used to, like visually used to, like when they go on a website, they know how this works. Cool. Yeah, this is really interesting. The white paper talks about the composable finance vision being similar to that of the port control protocol, which I really like that analogy. Maybe you can explain that a little bit, and then we can get into some of the more technical stuff.
Yeah, I mean, so basically, like, everybody's looking for like the TCP/IP of blockchains, and then like the HTTPS on top of that. TCP/IP is essentially IBC. I think it's like careless for any, like, I don't know how much you want to go into like me ranting about IBC, but basically like,
Do it, man.
yeah. So
You're on the right podcast for that.
yeah. So I mean, I think our perspective has like really been shaped by the work that was done on IBC over all these past years. And I've seen a bunch of protocols pop up and say, oh, we're going to create our own message passing. Or for instance, LayerZero, who basically took IBC and said, okay, all the work that light clients are doing, let's just replace with oracles and relayers, which is like, I don't think people really care or understand the impacts of that until these types of things get hacked. But when you really think about how do you onboard the next $100 billion worth of institutional assets into the ecosystem, do you really think a Circle or a institution like Franklin Templeton, like one of these guys that has a lot of capital, that's doing really important stuff for their clients across the global economy, are they going to want to take a risk at all, and then have to go back to their LPs and say, hey, we've lost $300 million to a bridge hack, sorry. So from my perspective, when I learned about IBC all these years ago, I was like, okay, this is like the only trustless bridge out there, period. And that's just the reality. And I think where IBC was limited initially was IBC wasn't able to go cross ecosystem. But now we've obviously changed that by bringing that to Polkadot, by bringing IBC to Near and a whole bunch of other chains in the future. It is really hard, right? Like speaking with like other bridges, they always mention that building IBC connections are really hard. And it is really hard because you have to do so much political like discussions with so many different protocols. You have to make protocol changes. You have to update repos from maintained by different organizations. But once it's done, something like this that is trustless is actually something interesting for a large player to get involved with, to do bridging. Because again, there is no reason for a Circle or Franklin Templeton or any of these guys to want to do bridging if they're going to even have 0.0005% of risk. Because they just don't have to take that risk, right? They're big enough where like their 2% APY is enough on US Treasury notes. So fundamentally for me, like I believe the future of interoperability, TCP/IP for blockchains, yes, there will be people who say, okay, it's expensive, it's slow, but that hasn't even been shown yet, right? Like LayerZero says, okay, we ripped out the light client because we expect it to be expensive with Ethereum 2.0. It's like, okay, guys, expect it to be expensive with ETH. Yeah. But then actually, if you look at ETH 2.0, it's possible and it's doable, and all like they're basically just saying this stuff is expensive and slow because they don't know what they're talking about, basically. So I think a world in which we expect to see like full trustlessness and TCP/IP will converge on IBC once all this noise of like excuses basically goes away.
I haven't had the 0x guy, the LayerZero guys on, but and I haven't dug deep into, like, I read the white paper when it first came out, but everybody that I talk to seems to have this gripe with that project, that it's like that it had gathered all this hype, but that it's not very secure. I think someone described it as like 2 multi-sigs.
Yes, I mean, the reason why people specifically in the Cosmos ecosystem don't like LayerZero is because how IBC works is you have to basically submit a block. Chain A wants to submit a message, and there's 2 things that are required. You need a block header submitted to the next chain, and you also need a confirmation proof, right? And so in IBC context, these things get hashed and are passed by a relayer, and the light client of the other chain on the other side my client of chain A on chain B verifies these things. And that's fully trustless, no need for a centralized authority in the middle. What LayerZero did is they said, okay, block header, we're just going to have an oracle figure that out, no problem. And then we're also going to have the relayer say, okay, this proof is legit as well. So now you've taken both of these components that are like essential to confirming a cross-chain transaction and given them to external third parties who, if they're the same, they can just pretend, right? So yeah, and there's like, no matter what they say, like pre-crime stuff that they're putting out, like the end result of this, and I don't want to make this whole podcast ripping about LayerZero, but like the end result is they've really just like misappropriate, like it proves that IBC is extendable to other ecosystems if they're using this tech, right? This concept, but they're also sort of like blaspheming IBC because IBC is supposed to be trustless, and they've now taken both pieces of verification and given them to centralized third parties.
Yeah. Yeah, and I think like to an IBC maxi, to someone who believes in IBC, I think that's sort of sacrilege. And
yeah.
Well, let's dive deep here. So Composable has many different layers in its stack, and you mentioned the Picasso parachain. We'll definitely get to that, but I'd love for you to walk us through like the different layers of the stack and what is the kind of role of each layer. Maybe we can kind of stop after each layer. So just to kind of summarize here as we go into this, there's the Composable XCVM, which is the cross-chain virtual machine, similar to say like an EVM on Ethereum, right? Like I think most people have like that idea of a VM. And then there's the routing layer, which has a role of routing different transactions that are explicited inside a contract written on the VM. Then there's the Picasso chain, which I think, from what I get, like acts as the way to actually send transactions on chain. And where Picasso is relevant is that it is IBC compatible. And then there's Mosaic, which is a bridge, but I'm not quite sure where that fits here. So that's kind of my high level understanding. Please tear that apart.
Yeah. So how this stack was basically envisioned is like the sort of similar to the OSI networking model. So you have like, and I don't have it in front of me, but it's basically like application layer, presentation layer, networking layer, blah, 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 hardware layer, infrastructure layer, something like that. And so how we decided to architect our stack is XCVM is like the orchestration layer. Then you have the transport layer, which is IBC. And we also make XCVM extendable. So if someone does want to use LayerZero or something, they can. Then from there, you have the infrastructure layer, which is this, and then before transport, there's routing layer, which is just as you mentioned, makes a decision of a pathway for execution for a generalized function like swap. And then at the bottom, you have this infrastructure layer, which is our parachains. So starting with the parachains, actually, we have built basically two parachains, a Kusama parachain and a Polkadot parachain. Kusama is Picasso, Polkadot is called Composable. And what they are is basically, imagine them as kind of like CosmosSDK chains, but they're just written in Substrate in a different environment with shared security from the relay chain. What we've done is we've built, we've had to build a lot of primitives for the Polkadot ecosystem to actually have DeFi. So we built a DEX called the Pablo DEX. And we've also built Apollo, which is an oracle, which is like the first oracle in the Polkadot ecosystem that actually works. We've also built vaults in there called Cubic. So we've had to build a lot of fundamental basic infrastructure for the parachain itself to actually like run and do DeFi things. And we consider Picasso to basically be this, and Composable to basically be this like cross-chain hub in a way, where like you have a DEX on there. There's a bunch of different connections to other chains over IBC. It's also connected to parachains, and eventually you want to connect it to ETH2 and stuff like that. Then when we had all these initial pieces, we said, okay, cool, but this is just Polkadot, and I don't really like have any attachment to like seeing one specific ecosystem succeed. I want to see all the ecosystems in crypto that people care about like included in our solution. And so we said, okay, well, this is a very base level customized infrastructure that we can, quickly perform runtime upgrades, etc. Next step was then to build IBC to other ecosystems, and that's actually where that Centauri. If you want to pull up that graphic again, Centauri is what we call our bridge to Cosmos. And so what we've done is we've had to basically. So a lot of this work actually started. Bunch of people were working on this in the past. It never really got much traction. And things were blocked for like ever and ever. And so last year, we then came in and started meeting with people like Jack, Informal, Tendermint, and quickly got all the pieces together and realized, okay, this is what we have to do on the Polkadot side. This is what we have to do on the Cosmos side as well. So from there, we said.
Sorry, just to break in here. What was the motivation of building this on as a Polkadot parachain
versus a Cosmos chain?
Or instead of a Cosmos chain or anywhere else, or building your own chain, for instance.
Yeah. So I think for us, we were interested in really like pushing forward with a stack that we were comfortable with and that we really like were excited about. So we really like Substrate. Everyone on the team is also like Rust maximalist. So we had like Substrate is a very nice framework to actually build blockchains. And I honestly believe that at some point there will be Substrate chains in the Cosmos ecosystem, right? Also, like I could imagine there being chains running Move in the Cosmos ecosystem as well. So like I think Substrate is a great framework to build blockchains. And for us, like being able to do a bunch of these interesting things that we couldn't do with the Cosmos SDK makes these DeFi applications cheaper and faster than we would have otherwise using another stack.
Okay. So this so I'm not super familiar like with the Polkadot ecosystem. Like it's been a while since I've kind of peered in there. Explain just for me and also perhaps our listeners who are more on the Cosmos side, what is the difference between a Polkadot parachain and Kusama?
Yes. So Kusama was designed to basically be this test net, but eventually like they had to like there was so much TVL and value in Kusama that it became like the DeFi degen hub. Like all the VCs were interested in Polkadot, and then when they all got airdropped Kusama, they all just like basically got out of their Kusama positions. And then suddenly, like all these DeFi degens, like were like, oh, what is this like testnet token? Let me go buy that. And they were handing it out for free back then too. And then all of a sudden, like there is this flourishing community of degens in Kusama, but not in Polkadot. And now it's sort of turned into this like big ecosystem that I don't think Polkadot even anticipated would happen.
Okay. So for comparison, it's as though we had kind of in Cosmos, like the Cosmos comparison would be if there was a sort of testnet Cosmos hub and testnet Osmosis and like all these other chains sort of like living on testnet validators, but at some point that thing would kind of become a thing of its own with its token value, etc. I guess the difference is that here that in Polkadot there is this notion of the parachain and the relay chain and so sort of like parachain that borrows the security from the main chain.
Mm-hmm.
Okay, got it.
Yeah. Definitely.
Interesting.
Yeah. But this is changing in the Cosmos with interchain security,
Of course,
right?
yeah.
So these things are becoming like very, very similar. I'd say the biggest difference at some point is going to be XCM is non-extendable to other ecosystems, whereas IBC is. Cosmos SDK is Go based. So naturally, like Rust Maxi is going to have a hard time building a blockchain in Cosmos.
Yeah, I think the Informal team are working on a Rust IBC implementation and maybe even Rust Tendermint, right?
Yeah, they are. So we're actually working with them on IBCRS and
Great.
Tendermint RS. But
Oh,
these things
cool.
don't change the fundamental building block.
So
Yeah.
where does XCVM sit in this schematic that I've got up on the screen?
So this is actually just a diagram of how the bridging works between Cosmos and Kusama, basically.
Okay. Yeah.
So this describes like how do we connect chains over IBC, like outside of the Cosmos ecosystem. And like you can see there's a bunch of different pieces, right? There's IBCRS, we have to do things on the Polkadot side with Pallet IBC. We have to do things on the Cosmos side. So these things are like super complex and annoying. But we've sort of brought all these pieces together and now we're getting them audited for a launch.
Okay. So looking at this, on one side we've got IBC and this beefy light client, and then there's a relayer. And so the relayer is kind of similar to an IBC relayer, where that Tendermint IBC palette over on Picasso is able to validate transactions over on the Cosmos side, and sort of vice versa. So it's sort of akin to IBC, but cross chain between Cosmos and like Polkadot ecosystem.
Exactly. That's right.
Okay. Very cool. Very, very cool. Yeah, I've got a couple of charts here that I pulled from the white paper. Yeah, I guess this here is where the XCVM and the routing, sort of materializes. And so the cross-chain virtual machine is where one would write cross-chain apps.
Yes.
And that sits over on Picasso. Is there an equivalent of that, like on Cosmos or on other ecosystems, or is that something that? Yeah.
Actually, XCVM is chain agnostic, so you could actually deploy a XCVM contract on any chain. We're also doing multiple SDKs for XCVM. Mm-hmm. So initially it'll be CosmWasm, so you could deploy this on any CosmWasm chain. Then we're also building a Solidity SDK for this as well. We're building a Move SDK, potentially, like deciding what happens with that ecosystem. But the idea is like these what happens is when an XCVM program is deployed, the messages that actually get sent is basically like, swap here, lend here, et cetera, et cetera. These things, this route gets determined by the routing layer, which basically is a network of solvers that come together to say, okay, the user wants to do X, here's the best way to do it. And then once these instructions are created by this routing layer, we can then send it over messages over IBC. So it's like a whole instruction set gets sent from one chain to the next, to the next, to the next for like an asynchronous path of execution. And how this works is through interpreters. So Picasso has an interpreter that can interpret a message and then do something on Picasso. So you don't need to deploy this on Picasso to actually run an XCVM contract, but we obviously prefer if you do, because it's easier, and that's what we're like shipping as the V1, but in the future, it will totally be chain agnostic.
Yeah. So that's interesting. I didn't realize that you guys were building also XCVM, like SDKs for all the different chains. Why did you build it as a CosmWasm sort of contract and not as a Cosmos SDK module, for example, as something that sits much closer to Tendermint?
Yeah, so that's a great question. So first of all, like we we're super interested in like WASM based smart contracting. And so for us, like as a parachain, we were first thinking about, okay, what are we going to have as the contract layer on our chain? Ink is not a viable solution. So we built CosmWasm on our parachain, which is like the first time anyone's ever brought CosmWasm outside of Cosmos. They should probably rename it at this point. And I think from our perspective, right, to ship a instruction set, you don't necessarily need to have these things in a module. And so we just kept seeing multiple different chains like Juno, Osmosis, adopting CosmWasm, and we just said, okay, if we can tap into the CosmWasm developer base and have them create CosmWasm contracts, it's probably an easier time to get to MVP than someone building a full-on kind of like module specifically. However, these different interpreters that I mentioned, we'll have to build a Cosmos SDK module interpreter for chains that don't have CosmWasm, for instance. On Polkadot, we've already built a module called Palette XCVM, which for chains that don't have, again, CosmWasm, that's how messages get interpreted. And then on Solidity, we have to write a Solidity smart contract. Aptos, we have to write a Move smart contract. Near, we have to write a Near contract. So for every chain, we have the same logic in the same types of interpreters, but specific to what that chain needs for the logic to be passed.
Okay, interesting. Wow, I'm learning so much here. Cool. So, and then, how does the VM reason about the different finality types? So, across the crypto ecosystem, we have like probabilistic finality, which would be something like Bitcoin or Ethereum currently. And then we have like on the other end of that, we have absolute finality, so like Tendermint. And then there are chains that sit somewhere in between, like provable finality, like things like the Casper finality gadget. And so how does the VM then, like when you're writing an application in XCVM, and then you're executing some transaction where tokens are moving from one chain to another and getting sent over here and like swapped, etc. Are there specific sort of ways to deal with that when you're getting a callback? Like, how does that work?
Yeah, so it's all dependent again. So that's why the interpreters are basically chain specific, because they deal with that basically.
Yeah.
So the interpreter receives a message, do XYZ on this chain, and then the interpreter itself goes out and calls the different things for you. So what ends up happening is you don't have a world in which you're now like sitting wondering what happened to your transaction. Is it final or not? Because the interpreter is calling it for you, and the interpreter understands what's actually happening like on a low level of the chain itself.
Okay. And it's able to send back like maybe some progress. So like, okay, if the transaction is taking say 5 minutes because you've got some finality that's not as absolute as say Tendermint, then the user interface would get back some kind of information, some kind of message about the status of all the transactions.
Yeah, so think of it as a circuit, right? So it's like hits the interpreter first, then you have 1, 2, 3, 4, as far as like whatever different functions getting executed, and then always the last step loops back to the interpreter to tell the interpreter, these steps have been completed. So this is like, and you could also make it such that each individual step is communicated back to the interpreter as well. We're actually releasing at Cosmoverse, like, don't want to reveal so much alpha, but basically like there's a dev interface that lets people be able to see what's actually happening. So shortly after Cosmoverse, like we hope to release a V1 that lets people be able to use this dev interface, do these types of funky cross-chain actions. So yeah.
Cool. Yeah, I think people in the chat are excited about all the alpha that's being dropped here. Yeah, let's keep some for Cosmoverse. Let's keep some alpha for Cosmoverse. Yeah. Cool. And then I guess like who are the different participants in all of this, right? So I guess like each chain has its own validators, but who's participating in routing? How are they incentivized? And
so routing layer is like something we're gonna work on next, because it's like actually not as difficult as the other pieces, because building a incentivized solver pathway situation is like really not.
It's been done.
It's been done, yeah. So, and the math is the same as like basically DEX aggregation. The hardest part there is monitoring. So we're actually working on monitoring first, right? Because if you as a solver route someone through to Terra, and Terra is going through a 99% destructive death spiral, like you just basically like screwed over the user that was accessing this application. And you as a solver, like you kind of need to like take responsibility for that. And that's where we're gonna have to figure out like the economics of slashing. So having solvers put down stakes for specific recommendations, and having monitoring tools basically like serve as a single source of truth to potentially slash a solver who's provided this like route. So the people who are really focused on this, like the core different players in this is, we need the relayers to relay to other ecosystems. So we could run relayers. Anyone can run a relayer. That's not a problem. And that's really like the biggest sort of player for us to expand. And then for us to bring IBC to other ecosystems, we actually need each individual protocol team to play ball with us. That's why we had to put out this near NEP 364 that took us like 8 weeks to get past. And we're actually one of the first teams outside of near to actually get an NEP actually passed. So that paves the way for IBC to near. So as far as participants goes, like all the stuff we're doing is like, there's like the dev side as far as like developer advocacy to get people interested into using XCVM. But then when you go sort of like lower level into like interop, like IBC, that's when we have to start talking to protocol teams directly. Soon we're gonna have to start speaking to Polygon. Soon we're gonna have to start speaking to EF when we're doing these types of things to extend IBC.
I think, because the name of the, I think I need to get a bell every time someone says interoperability. I need to like ding. So full disclosure, like I'm speaking with your team about being part of your sort of infrastructure. And so there's oracles and collators. Those are part of the relayer, like the relayer component, right?
So the oracles and collators. So oracles are basically what I mentioned previously, is like the Apollo oracles. Like the first time there's an oracle in the actual .sama ecosystem. Think of it like Band, but for Polkadot and Kusama.
Yeah.
Collator is basically like a validator for a Cosmos chain. So that's what a collator is.
Okay. And one of the things that I thought was interesting about the in the white paper is that you make use of RelayerSets. Can you explain why?
Yeah, so this was a proposed. So back in the day when we hadn't thought more deeply about ETH2 and the merge seemed like a very far away, forgotten concept, we were exploring like how to bridge to non-light client based ecosystems, places like Solana, etc. And so that's where like this RelayerSet TSS stuff comes in. It's like bridging to other ecosystems that don't have light clients. To be honest, like we've shelved a lot of those efforts because we're IBC maxis now, and like we just don't really believe that any, like I think there are some ecosystems where it's like legitimately really difficult, like Solana, because they don't have light clients. But like if ETH2 is possible, like I'm sure Wormhole, a trusted bridge, like people trust Wormhole to some extent. Like I'm sure Wormhole could just sit and own Solana, and then like we could be the canonical like ETH bridge that's trustless basically. I'm happy with that future.
Yeah, makes sense. And I think one component we haven't talked about maybe briefly here is Mosaic, and how does the Mosaic fit into all this?
Yeah, so Mosaic was going to be basically what I mentioned, which is like a lot of this like non-light client based bridging.
Okay.
So what we ended up doing is we've learned a lot from building those types of bridges, things like having the gas token on the destination chain, having like cross-chain swaps actually route through pools with good liquidity, making sure that there's an option to cancel a bridge transaction after it's been started, like all these different things we've learned. And so now Mosaic is going to become this product for that encompasses like all of our different bridges, like the Centauri stuff, the near stuff we're doing. And it's basically going to be like the UX of our transfer, sort of like same way Axelar has satellite.money.
Okay.
Like this will be
Yeah.
Mosaic.
So it's like it'd be a bridge product that anybody can use, and that isn't quite like the full extent of amazing UX, like kind of right there in your app, but something that's a bit more manual for users.
Yeah, I mean, I think basically like trustless bridging is fantastic, but I think a lot of the reasons why people really like trusted bridges is because of these UX components, right? And these things should just happen under the hood. So the idea would be someone goes to our Mosaic front end, they're using Centauri and these other trustless bridges behind the scenes, but they still get these benefits of gas tokens on the other side. Like these nice UX components just are options. And I don't think we've ever seen that type of stuff like wrapped into a trustless bridge before. And so that's like really our intention, is to make things as seamless for trustless bridges, like for trusted bridges, trustless, basically.
Great. Well, yeah, I'd love to talk a little bit about the work that you're doing on IBC, because you guys are working on extending IBC. So let's dive into that a little bit.
Yeah. So as I mentioned, the near NEP 364 was merged last week, or to actually this past, I forget what day it is, Tuesday it was merged. So that's been kind of like a pretty big highlight for near. So now we're like pretty much unblocked to proceed with the actual integration of IBC there. So that's going to take a little bit more time, but like we're very confident in our work there. And the near protocol team has been super supportive. As far as IBC itself, between Polkadot and Kusama, we released a blog 2 days ago where we said we're using IBC to bridge Polkadot and Kusama, which has never been done before. So that's going to be the first sort of major key milestone to tell people, okay, look, like we know what we're doing with IBC. We've brought it to a whole another ecosystem, and it's being used as the underlying backbone of a bridge that's bridging two ecosystems that's never been bridged before. From there, that paves the way for us to actually release this Cosmos bridge. So the bridge between Cosmos and Polkadot and Kusama to start with. So we're already like speaking to a bunch of different Cosmos chains to try to like release that bridge and have it like fully testnet ready, and then follow that up with the near work. We're already starting to investigate Polygon and ETH2. So yeah.
So when you say like that this will be released as a bridge, I guess in the first iterations of this means that one would have to go to this kind of interface as you would with any other bridge, whether it's like Wormhole or Connects or whatever, execute those transactions. But the dream is that basically just in your wallet, you can have some Atom and you want to move them over to Kusama, and your wallet in the background is making use of this bridge to send those assets over without having to like leverage this sort of interface.
Yes, yeah, that's where then like XCVM and stuff becomes interesting, right? Because for instance, like Osmosis could just add an XCVM interface to their front end that talks to our chain, for instance, and have, if someone wants to trade Atom for Dot or Dot for Atom, then you could just do that all from osmosis, and on the background, messages are being passed, the assets are being moved, you're signing transactions with your Kepler wallet, but the reality is like you just end up with DOT on Cosmos, on osmosis.
Yeah. And then would it be for a user, would it be like a wrapped asset, or would it be more akin to an IBC asset that's kind of like native to the chain? Because I think that's an important distinction.
It is not a wrapped asset. So it's wrapped in that like so IBC is burn and mint, or it's burn mint. It's also like lock and release situation, but like IBC is basically native, right? So there's no like, you don't print like Centauri USDC, like that doesn't exist, right? So as long as we can get the chains on the other side to recognize DOT as the native asset that's being brought over IBC, and they add it to their assets module, it'll be considered native. We will on our side make Atom, Osmo, all these assets, even some CW20 assets, like native assets in our assets palette. So those chains need to basically recognize the same thing, and then they will not be considered wrapped, and they're actually just IBC native assets.
Okay. And what's your view on like, EVMOS's role as as a bridge to the from between like the Ethereum ecosystem and the Cosmos ecosystem, and what kind of complexity does that add? Because now the Cosmos ecosystem isn't just IBC assets, but it's also these potentially these ERC20 wrapped assets that are coming into the Cosmos ecosystem through this other route, which is whatever bridges are connected there. I guess like Nomad or
Axelar.
or Axelar. I was talking about this. I think with Fede, where you could end up in a situation where you're moving tokens kind of in a circle, and like they're just being like wrapped in, and you have to like unwrap them when in fact they're just going back to the main chain. I guess it's like a broader question about like the complexity of like fungibility across chains when we're wrapping assets. What in terms of user experience, I think like this is one of the big things that we haven't quite figured out yet, is like how do we create fungibility between tokens that essentially are the same?
I mean, that's the thing. Like, do you even want that, right? Because if you have Axel USDC and Nomad USDC, and Nomad just got wrecked for $200 million plus, or however much it was, which ended up making the peg of Nomad USDC basically worthless.
Yeah.
Like, I think that basically, if we start referring to assets like Axel USDC, etc., as like canonical USDC, we're basically like rugging users, and it's nice from a UX perspective. But like if Axelar gets hacked, you just basically mapped Axel USDC to real USDC, which I mean, there's already USDC coming to Cosmos anyway, right? So I mean, I think it's best to just I think that there are ways so that you can get rid of the wrapping unwrapping problem, and that's IBC, right? But when you introduce a trustless bridge, a trusted bridge, you have to put those 3 letters in before it to let the user know, okay, like this isn't just USDC, like I also have bridge risk here.
Yeah.
So yeah.
I mean, I think I'd like to talk a little bit about, you mentioned that there would be a DEX on the on the parachain. What's like the role of this DEX, and where do you expect liquidity to come from?
Yeah, so the role of this DEX is basically just like, Picasso, we intend to connect all these different chains. So like, let's have an AMM on the chain that is like connected to all these connections. So liquidity is going to come from the Polkadot, it's going to come from Kusama, it's going to come from Near, hopefully also comes from Cosmos. And I think the role basically is it just becomes like a counterpart for osmosis within the Polkadot ecosystem. And I believe that like the world in which someone can swap, like say there's an Atom Osmo pair on Osmosis, and there's an Atom Osmo pair on Pablo. Like imagine a user that has Osmo on Picasso can just send the Osmo to the pool and then have the opposite side of the trade get executed on Osmosis, right? I think that's really interesting because then when you have like two liquidity pools that can now perform swaps between each other, like things become cheaper because you can introduce this layer of cows, like coincidence of wants, like order matching between the two AMMs. So I think, you know, it's not a competitive product to Osmosis in any way. It's really just supposed to be like another cross-chain AMM out there that serves as this like DEX for a hub that includes Cosmos, Polkadot, Kusama, Near, and all these other chains we connect to.
Okay.
Also, just because, like, in all reality, has there been any DeFi in Polkadot? No, there hasn't. So we need to actually. So I think like one of the major reasons we're still in the Polkadot and Kusama ecosystem is like I think there's a big opportunity. There's a lot of TVL there. There's a lot of dot maxis there who don't want to do anything else on other chains. So let's introduce cool DeFi primitives. We can get some of that TVL and hopefully like Cosmos and Near and other places can benefit from that, because if the dot maxis mines become a little bit more open, there's a ton of TVL locked on the relay chains, right? A lot more. I don't know how much. I don't know if Adam has flipped dot yet, but like I don't think so. So I think there's like the dot TVL that's not being used is like fresh dry powder that can flow into all these ecosystems.
Yeah. Well, that brings me to my next question is like, what do you what is your outlook for the Polkadot ecosystem at the moment? And I guess I maybe could preface that with a lot of the conversations that I've been having with people in like sort of in the Polkadot ecosystem and close to the Polkadot ecosystem feel that there has been like lots of missed opportunities, and you know there's a time window here where Polkadot has to, you know, kind of change the course and, you know, sort of remain relevant in the face of, you know, ecosystems that have a lot of, well, Cosmos one, I mean, like that is one ecosystem I think right now that has a lot of hype, and I think a lot of people think it's a little bit under the radar, and but then, you know, there's just ETH2 and Celestia and like, so there's a lot of competition and a lot of developers are choosing to go to these other ecosystems. And so, yeah, I'm curious what your, since you guys have been in the Polkadot ecosystem, how you feel about that.
I mean, I think like Polkadot builds great tech, right? Like there's nice technology. Maybe a lot of people don't see that. But I you know, I'm keen on staying in the Polkadot ecosystem for the foreseeable future. And hopefully like we can try to drive some like adoption of like what's actually happening over there. But honestly, I think what's going to happen is like, again, I can't emphasize this enough. Like the biggest, most bullish piece of Polkadot is DOT. Like this asset is so valuable and so liked by so many people that I think it could be a very solid base asset for a lot of DeFi across so many different chains. So I think as far as like relevancy goes, like so long as DOT can move to other ecosystems and maxis can stop being maxis, Polkadot has a future. I think also Polkadot will live on with Substrate as well. Like people really like Substrate. I really like Substrate. I think even if people become standalone chains, et cetera, they still bring Substrate with them, and they still want to maintain an outpost in Polkadot as well. So I think no matter what, like there is a place for Polkadot, and it's because of Substrate and it's because of DOT, the actual asset. But yeah, I think in the future, like to be honest with you, some Cosmos chains don't need to be Cosmos chains. They can be rollups on Celestia. Some parachains don't need to be parachains. They can be rollups on Celestia or Polygon Avail or Eigenlayer or any of these other, or even ETH2, right? So there's just like going to be this future of like, what's the actual necessity for app chains? Do Cosmos and Polkadot become layer twos on Ethereum, basically?
Yeah.
So I don't know. I don't know. I think for the foreseeable future, this like roll up vision, this modular stack vision is like a little bit further out. I'm a big believer in it. I definitely believe in like the execution layer, DA, settlement layer thesis that Celestia has. I think that everything will trend towards application specific rollups, but I think it's a bigger story than that. I think we still need monolithic blockchains to do specific things, but those things could just be in the execution layer like fuel.
Yeah. No, I think that makes a lot of sense. And I feel like I feel like we're at the beginning of a real shift in terms of how we look at these ecosystems. And that shift, in 3 or 4 years from now, we're going to look back on these times as when things were like extremely segregated and vertical. And I'm not my thesis on how this looks in 5 years is still not exactly clear. But one thing's certain is that the boundaries of each of these ecosystems is about to get very porous.
Yes.
And when I think of what that is, immediately I think like, this is the interchain, really. Like it is really the internet of blockchains, where different chains are economic centers, and they communicate with each other using different protocols. And certainly some of those some protocols are going to win out, others are not, and there will probably be dominant ones. But yeah, users will use applications, and they're not going to know where their tokens are going or how they're getting transferred, or like where that liquidity is getting swapped. Yeah, I think like it's a great future. It feels like. Yeah.
I think so too, and I think for us to prepare for the modular stack, like we really want to become like Fuel is like the execution layer for the modular stack. Celestia is like the DA for the modular stack. There isn't an interoperability solution for the modular stack. That's what we want to be, basically. Again, this is like some galaxy brain stuff that like I don't want to leak on this podcast. But yeah, I think that's really like, I think, IBC, we're only scraping the surface of what IBC can be used for.
Yeah.
Right. And that's all I'm going to say for now.
Yeah, no, look, when just something like interchain accounts and interchain queries, I think is going to create such an explosion of innovative use cases that it's going to be so cool to see. Like the next year, I think it will be very, very interesting.
Yeah, absolutely.
So what's the roadmap, and what are your big milestones coming up?
So big milestones, October. Hopefully we're aiming to launch our KSM dot bridge over IBC. That kicks off the launch of everything on Picasso, Apollo, Pablo, the Pika Picasso token, TGE. Then after that, probably like the bridge to Cosmos first, and then V1 of XEVM. By the way, also before all of this, we'll deploy CosmWasm on the chain too. So that'll also
on the
be
Picasso chain.
On the Picasso chain, yep.
Okay.
So all these things, and then basically like bridge to Cosmos, then XEVM V1. That's basically like the next, like we've been working on this for a very long time. So like, and this is why, because we wanted this launch to encompass everything: DeFi, bridging, XEVM, and CosmWasm. So yeah, so that's basically the big goal for like the next through end of year, basically, is to get all of these things done.
And yeah, tell us more about this TGE, and will there be a token sale?
Yeah, so so the shipment of the TGE begins with an LBP. So if someone wants to buy a Pika to set the price through this LBP, like balancer LBP style copper launch situation, that's the beginning of the TGE. So anyone who wants to do that, they can do that on TGE date. We'll release the actual date when we know it, but the biggest thing we've needed for the TGE, right, is like liquidity. So like who's going to actually use the Pablo DEX? And now that we have this KSM dot bridge, or we've released this, right, it's much more simple for people to understand, okay, dot is going to be the main liquidity token used within Pablo. and within like the overall sort of like Picasso launch strategy. So all the pieces are there now. We just need to make sure these things are safe and audited before we ship them out to users. And to be honest, internally, like we have a big team, and we also have like a dedicated QA and testing team. So like when we say QA and auditing, we don't just mean like someone like, I don't know if you've seen the meme of the guy going like this, like smart contract auditor. Like we mean like NASA style mission critical treatment of software. So that's why these things take a little bit of time when we say QA and audit. So it's a bit, so the launch date is a bit nebulous, but we're hoping that this what we've forecasted makes sense. But of course, things come up in audit, so we can't really commit.
Yeah. Well, over at Interop Ventures, which is my company, we're seriously looking at running some oracles and collator infrastructure. So, hopefully we'll also be part of the early genesis of the network.
Awesome.
Great. Brainjar, thanks so much for coming on. It's been really interesting. Love getting deep into blockchain interoperability, and looking forward to having you on again soon.
Yeah, thanks so much for having me. Really appreciate it.
Cheers.